Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Aliana Kernodle. The latest test results show more students in Wisconsin's public schools are scoring better at reading and writing, but critics say it's an illusion. Joining me to tell us more about this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, what's going on with these test scores and what concerns are the critics raising?
Yeah, Eliana. So essentially, I think most people are familiar either from, their children's educational experience or their own, that if you went to public school, you had to take these different kinds of assessments to see where you lined up and basically just give the state some assessment data. And there's a lot of different reasons why states have to do this. I think that they're checking on student progress and school performance and, in a way, teacher performance. There's also federal mandates, right? Like there are federal laws that say that, you have to have some data. And that was a big push from No Child Left Behind to have that accountability data, to have sort of that year over year, like let's see how much kids are learning. So these have like a broader thing. These aren't just because states want to do that because they want to give students more tests, but they're trying to figure out some of that accountability measures. So yeah, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction this week released the results from the Forward exam. That's for middle and elementary school students, as well as the ACT for high schoolers. So the Forward exam is the state's own assessment, basically, and that's run by the state, and that's given to middle elementary school students. And so that showed that about half of students in both public and private school choice programs during the 2023-2024 school year are considered proficient in English language arts and mathematics. So that's about the halfway mark there. The hard part about the proficiency is that that's like what you're supposed to be able to get. That doesn't mean that these kids can't necessarily read, whether they can't necessarily do the math problems, but it's that's what the state has deemed proficiency should look like. And so that's up from last year's scores that showed 39% were proficient in reading and 41% were proficient in math. And I'm getting this from the Center Square. That's a sister site to Chalkboard News, but their contributor Benjamin Yount wrote this piece on the test scores. And some people, they call that ludicrous, right? So Quentin Clabon, an educational analyst for the Institute for Reforming Government, was very critical of this because of what he said that the Department of Public Instruction did to change the test scores. So he said that jump there was not because students were doing better, because they got the more learning, because the teachers were doing the right thing, because they had the sort of that, post-COVID academic recovery, which is very elusive, very difficult for a lot of schools to obtain. He said that it's because they changed it. And we had another contributor write in, an opinion contributor for Chalkboard News. They said the same thing. They said that there was Patricia Levesque for Excel and Ed. And she said, what Wisconsin is doing is making tests easier to pass. They're lowering the bar essentially for their state assessments and like the passing scores. They're changing that to make it look like students are achieving more potentially. And it's really interesting to hear why they're doing that. And a lot of that kind of stems back to, and I saw this while I was looking up stuff for that piece while I was editing it. Essentially, the State Department of Public Instruction, it says like, if you tell a kid that they're bad at doing something or that they didn't get the right level on their test, then they give up, right? And so what they're kind of saying is we're going to make it easier to help kids feel like they're doing a good job. And I think what the Excel and Ed opinion piece is saying is that's not the point of these assessments, right? What you want to know is how well are kids doing, and it might not be the best way to measure, but it is a way to measure, and parents need to know how their children are doing so that they can have interventions. And I think that that's something that's not, really being talked about in terms of the Department of Public Instruction, like in terms of like how do you help those children, because they're kind of focusing on the feelings and having them come to school, maybe some of those like let's make them feel good about themselves kind of thing. But then on the other side of that is, but if you don't know that you're falling behind, then how do you get the help that you need? Or how do parents know that, okay, my kid is 2 grade levels behind in math, I need to get them to stay after school every day and work with the special math tutor that the school has available. But if you don't know that, you don't know that. And I think that is basically what Excel and Ed calls that is the honesty gap. So they look basically at the measures between the national, the federal, they're called the nation's report card, and then the statewide test scores, and then they contrast that. And so if there's a huge gap, that's a way of saying, okay, the state's assessment is not as accurate as it should be. And so that there is that, quote, honesty gap by looking at the differences there. And so I think that that's a very interesting question that this is bringing in, is like, how do you tell? It's also interesting too that the current governor of Wisconsin, Governor Tony Evers, he served as the state superintendent of education back in 2012. And then he had these nation's report card aligned test scores to get that clearer picture of student achievement in some of these core areas. And they got that kind of lined up in terms of that honesty gap. They really brought that down. According to the Excel and Ed op-ed, that narrowed to fewer than 5 points in 2013. So in a few years, they had that settled up. But then that is likely to come back. So that's kind of the question of when we get the national data back, kind of seeing it is going to be very interesting to compare that to these most recent test scores from the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. So essentially, it's just, and when somebody interviewed Governor Evers about that, he basically said, I wouldn't do that. I would not change the standards, essentially, but that is up to the Department of Public Instruction. So he deferred it to that office, but he said that that's not something that he would do, and that he previously had worked on trying to get that to be a clearer picture of student achievement. Instead of kind of inflating it. So that's what critics are saying about it. And I think that it's vital for parents to be aware. If you go to school in Wisconsin and your child's scores come back and it looks like much higher than it was last year, it's one of those things of, well, you have to kind of know the backstory, and it might not be immediately clear from the Department of Public Instruction that that's what they were doing, right? So I think that that's something to know when you're going in, is that if you're changing the metric on a math test, for example, for your school, and it looks like, oh, you did way better, but they changed the grading rubric, you have to say, okay, I need to factor that in. How much does my kid actually know about math versus are they just, like how much of that was because of that sort of, grade inflation in a way. So I think it is kind of, as with all of these, it looks kind of simple at the surface level, but then when you start digging into some of the deeper things, it gets really complicated. It gets really interesting. There's a lot of nuance involved, a lot of different moving pieces, and a lot of different perspectives on how to best help students. But then, sometimes, one side is going to say, well, that's actually going to hurt them. And then the other side, well, no, the other way around is the way it is. So it's one of those things where it's a lot more confusing than it seems like it is.
Yeah, well, and whichever position you take, to some degree, it's still important for parents to understand this so that they know why the grades are changing. So whether it's, realigning a state test with that national report card, making it so fewer students are passing, or it's changing it to make it more lenient, either way, that's going to cause a number of students to change kind of where they fall in passing or not, or like different states use different language for the different places you can fall on the testing, but that's an important thing to be able to understand, so you know why those changes are being made. Is it because something happened during the school year that your kid is lagging behind, or is it that there was a change made in the way that the testing is done?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more either at Chalkboard News or our sister site, thecentersquare.com.